Hi, this is Pat McDonald, your host for Vote for Vermont, where our tagline is listening beyond the soundbites. Joining me tonight is Ben Kinsley, who's host, co-producer, and our one and only sponsor, in case anybody's interested. Ben, would you care to give your sponsor spiel?
Sure. So yeah, my name is Ben Kinsley. I have a consulting firm called Imperium Advisors. It kind of started out as a policy research and development organization, and quickly realized it's not enough to have a good idea. You also have to be able to sell that idea, get people to buy into it. So from that, just spun off a whole bunch of different services, everything from strategic communications, government relations, social media, a whole bunch of different things. So if you have a nonprofit in Vermont, you're trying to find your audience with the right message, look us up, imperiumvt.com.
You got that stump speech down really well.
This show helps with that. I get to practice it.
I'm impressed. And now for our very special guest, we have with us tonight Jim Condos, who is the Vermont Secretary of State. And I think you've seen him in the paper recently. He's been a very busy man. And we welcome you, Jim. I think this is the first time on the show, is it not?
First time this year, maybe.
This year, yes. First you were on a year ago, right. So when you announce for your candidacy, you have to come back, when you announce. I'm not going to ask you any questions, so
I've already put my candidate filing in.
You haven't announced it, is it? Can we use my show to announce it? That'd be a first. That'd be good. You heard it here, folks. Anyway, Jim, we always ask our guests, as you remember, to tell them a little bit about themselves and about your background.
Sure. So I grew up in the city of Burlington, and then in high school moved to South Burlington, where I graduated from South Burlington High School, later from UVM. Pat, your mother-in-law,
that's right.
We know, was my kindergarten and sixth grade teacher at Adams School on South Union Street in Burlington. And then I worked in the private sector for approximately 30 years, working for a Fortune 100 company, a $100 million Vermont family-owned distribution company, and a regulated utility. During that time, I also served on 18 years on the South Burlington City Council. The last 8 of those years, I was the chair of the council. I served, when I was on the council, I served on the National League of Cities Board of Directors, which, there's members from each of the 50 states. So I was on the board of directors there. As you know, Pat, I went on and served 8 years in the state Senate, where I chaired education and government operations. Government operations happens to be the committee that actually oversees much of the Secretary of State function. And then the last 10 years, I've been the Secretary of State. And while I've been Secretary of State, I have been as an active member of the National Association of Secretaries of State, better known as NASS. I became the president. And during that time period, I also I testified before Congress regarding the 2016 Russian cyber attacks and the effects on Vermont and other states. Those 2 committees were the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence and the Senate Rules Committee. And I'm currently on the Council of State Governments Overseas Voting Initiative, where I serve as the national co-chair with the Washington Secretary of State, Kim Wyman. So that's kind of my background. It's long and varied. I have both the public sector as well as the private sector. And I think I've pretty much brought a lot of my private sector background to the Office of Secretary of State. And as you know, Pat, and probably Ben, we've done a complete transformation of the office from what used to be very much a paper-driven system to a digital environment. That digital environment has provided us with a more accurate, timely, and efficient databases and service to customers. And I'm extremely proud of that work that we've done. And we can get into more later, but that's kind of my background.
That's great. Jim, I have to compliment you on something, and I think I've done it before, but I was always impressed. You're a very strong supporter of ethics, which Campaign for Vermont is. But in the Senate, whenever there was any bill that you thought had any kind of conflict of interest, you always stood up and said, count me out. I mean, you were great at that. And I wish others would take your lead, because it's a too small a state. There's got to be some times when this happens to people, especially those like yourself who volunteer and get involved.
So there were two of us in the state Senate, myself and Jim Greenwood.
Jim Greenwood used to do it.
And Jim Greenwood I worked for a regulated utility, and he was on the board of directors for a regulated utility. And Jim and I can't remember the actual Senate rule, but there was a Senate rule about conflict of interest. And even though both of us did not technically receive compensation with regard to the bill, we felt that it was important that we would stand up and say, we're not voting on this bill because we're declaring this rule and refraining from a vote. And it was just something I always believed in, and I wish more people would do that.
Oh, you, me both. And I always noted you for that. And whenever I talk about you, I'd always comment why you did that and how you did it and how impressed. And Jim Greenwood, of course, he wound up working for me in the Department of Labor. That man is awesome. He's just great. I really miss him.
Jim was a good guy. He was a good guy from the Northeast Kingdom.
Yep, good guy. Anyway, on to the questions. Ben?
So yeah, let's start out kind of from the beginning and talk about what is the function of the Secretary of State's office. A lot of people may not be familiar with that. Of course, you oversee elections, but there's a lot more to it than that.
Yeah. So Ben, it's really it's a great question, because a lot of people do ask, what is it that you do? So I have 4 divisions that I oversee as an independently elected constitutional officer. One is VSARA, the State Archives. It's actually, the State Archives sort of existed prior to 2009, but in 2009, the Archives and Records Management Unit from BGS combined to form VSARA, the Vermont State Archives and Records Administration Unit. And essentially, we protect our state's most cherished documents. We have the original Constitution of Vermont there. We have the original, and I'll say this, we have the original 12 Bill of Rights that were signed by the governor and sent back to Congress after approval by the legislature. And I say 12 because only 10 actually exist. There were twos that did not make it into the Bill of Rights. One of them, I don't know what one of them is, I don't remember, but the other one was to limit the size of Congress to a little over 200. So
interesting.
I can't imagine why that didn't pass. Exactly. Sign me up.
So anyway, we have those old documents. We have old maps. I mean, for instance, after Tropical Storm Irene came thundering through Vermont, wiping out bridges and roads and whatever, Agency of Natural Resources and Department of VTrans actually were in our archives pulling out all these old maps, trying to find out where the roads and the bridges actually used to be.
Oh, wow.
So they could start to rebuild Vermont. So there was a lot of that going on during, in that recovery period after in 2011. And so that's the archives unit. I have the Office of Professional Regulation, which is the arm that regulates, oversees, enforces, investigates complaints to approximately 50 professions and 75,000 license holders. As I said, their main goal is to protect the health and safety of Vermonters. It's not about protecting or encouraging those professions. It's about protecting Vermonters. So that's the role. It's an oversight role. Corporations, if you want to do business in Vermont, you have to come to the corporations division. You have to register your business with the state of Vermont. You can also register your nonprofit with the state of Vermont that way. And by the way, you can do it online now. It used to be, when I first took office, it was all paper driven. So if if you were starting a new business, you would fill out your paperwork, mail it in. So it would take, 3 or 4 days to get to us. We would have to process it and then mail it back to you. Now it's done almost instantaneously. We hold UCC liens, United Commercial Uniform Commercial Code liens of business to business, business to banks. That's the paper. The official paperwork is filed with us to maintain that database, and we could have 2 to 3 million of those in our archives. We do about 100,000 transactions a year.
Wow.
So there's, in fact, we're often, JFO will ask us, how are the numbers looking for corporations being formed? Things like that. When Green Mountain Power and was not Velco, but Rutland Service, Electric Service, when they combined into one unit, we handled the merger paperwork. It was done through the lawyers, but we had to be there to handle that paperwork. So it's just it's that kind of constant work to make it easier for people to do business in the state of Vermont. We helped initiate the business portal between UI and the Department of Labor and Tax Department in our office, so that you could go to one place and your information would only have to be entered once, and then you'd have to answer a few questions for each office. And then it would get sent off to those offices to approve. For instance, when you start a new business, you come to our office to register, and that's pretty seamless, and you get your paperwork almost immediately. Then you would have to go to the tax department to get a tax ID, and they would ask you a few questions and send it off, and then they would issue the tax ID. And with UI, the same kind of thing, in order to get that stuff. So that had been tried, and Pat, you might remember this. It had been tried under Dean, under Douglas, and it was not really until Shumlin, and I'm not trying to give the credit to Shumlin because he just basically put us in a room and said, figure it out. So we did, and that was a very basic business portal. I can talk when we talk about upcoming legislation or this year's legislation. We can talk about the new bill for the new business portal, but that's kind of a slightly different tact. And then, of course, we have elections, and we oversee the elections. We don't have authority over the town clerks, but we do assist them. We provide guidance. We provide education. When the laws change, we help to educate them on those changes. Our office pays for vote tabulators for the general election and primary ballots. We don't pay for local elections in any way, but we do pay for some of the other stuff. And of course, this is a big year for us with what's going on, and those are the basic divisions of my office that I oversee. I do want to add one thing which we did that really was kind of interesting. When I first took office, I sat down with my fiscal director, and we were going over the budget, and about 10 minutes in, I looked at him and I said, he was explaining to me that we get 1.8 million in general funds on July 1st. And then the following June 30th, whatever's left gets swept. And usually he says it's more than the 1.8 million. So I started looking at the numbers. I looked at the cash flow as the year went on, and I said to him, so why do we get this money? And he goes, because we've always gotten it. And that's
God.
Pat's laughing because that's the age-old statement from state workers at times. But it's I said, well, it looks to me like we could actually subsist just based on our fees. that we don't really need any general fund dollars. That's taxpayer money. General fund is taxpayer. And he looked at me and he said, "Oh, you understand this stuff?"
Exactly.
And I said, "Yes, I do." So it took us about 2 years, but we finally got the legislature to take the 1.8 million back. And I told them, one of the concerns that some of the legislative committees, especially the Probes, had was, well, how do we know you're not going to overspend? And I said, you still have to approve my budget.
Right.
I submit a budget to you, you still have to approve it. So, that's the oversight. And so that's where we've been. And I will knock on wood, but say that one thing I'm very proud of is we've never had to go to the legislature in January for a mid-year budget adjustment. We've always maintained that we work within our budget and we manage that budget. For instance, before the shutdown of state government and businesses throughout the state, before that happened, we actually had issued a statement to all of our division directors telling them discretionary spending is shut down because we could see what was coming. And we just said only need to spend what we need to spend, not go beyond that.
I just wrote
discretionary spending right at the moment. There's not a lot of new businesses forming to generate fees.
Yeah.
No, nor should there be. We shouldn't be spending much of anything. I just wrote an article about the Budget Adjustment Act for publication because people don't understand it. And what surprised me, just what you're saying about your $1 million, a lot of departments had excess money, and some of them had some serious amounts. And I'm thinking, what didn't get done? Why did they budget that? Like, did something not get done this year? And I bet somebody's going to ask those questions. And do you really need that money?
Well, it's a good point. And when I first started, we had 5 funds that we operated out of. And we actually, when we gave back the 1.8 million, we also reduced the number of funds. We have our OPR funds, which are the state cannot touch that money. That stays within OPR. It's totally fee-based or license-based, and so that money stays there. Then we had, obviously, we have our federal election dollars that we get. And the state can't use it for anything else, so that stays. The only thing we have left is the Secretary of State Services Fund, is what it's called, and that's where pretty much every other fee goes into. And we actually simplified the budgeting by doing this. I mean, Steve Klein was all in favor of it from the JFO, and we really just. At the end of the year, the Secretary of State Services Fund is the one that gets swept into the general fund. So at the end of the year, if we have anything left that we haven't expended, it will get swept into the general fund. So, and I'm very proud to say that in the last 5 years, we've probably given well over $4 million back in addition to our regular projection, which is usually around $2 million.
That's a very refreshing change of mindset, because when I worked in state government, it was, how can we spend it all? Because at the end of the year, whatever you spent is what they use as the basis for the following year budget. So if you returned $1 million, you got $1 million less, and everybody thought, well, let's rush and spend it. And I really understand that that's completely changed, which is about time.
Well, and Pat, it's on that premise, I think it is important to understand. People have asked me, like, how have you done all these IT projects that you've done? And I said, because first of all, I have credibility with the legislature, but secondly, I've not said, here's my $10 million operating budget, and they approve that, and then I come back to them a month later and say, oh, and I need $2 million to do this project. What I did was I gave them a budget in the beginning that says, I need $12 million. Here's what I'm going to do with it. And then the next year, hopefully I have not overspent, which we haven't, knock on wood. And I have that credibility with the legislature. So
Right.
They trust me.
Well, I must say, we always looked with anticipation for the OPR bill in GovOps. It's the worst bill.
Absolutely.
It's pages and pages of the most minute details. And last week, I don't know if you read this, we had David Hurley come on because, David was my attorney in personnel, and he's the director of the Vermont Board of Medical Practices. And you two kind of split the medical profession and split a lot of professional jobs. He does doctors and other professions in that area, and then you, on the other hand, through OPR, do nurses. And I just thought that was a very interesting split of licensing.
There is a history there, Pat, and this history actually goes back to when Jim Douglas was Secretary of State in the 80s. OPR was originally created in 1989 as an umbrella agency for independent boards and professions to share resources, become more efficient. And at that time, 1989, Medical Practice Board was under OPR. There were a lot of, let's just put it this way. The doctors thought they were different from every other profession, and that they should have independence and be able to do whatever they needed to do.
Right.
And there was, so between Douglas, Don Hooper, Milne, and then Markowitz, there was this tension between all four of those secretaries of state. In 1999, when Secretary Markowitz became Secretary of State, just after being elected, she tried to exert some control over the board, the Medical Practice Board, after there were some poorly run investigations and prosecutions. And there was an MOU that was entered into that gave the Secretary of State some limited oversight over the Medical Practice Board. It failed. And in 2002, Secretary Markowitz was tired of taking the blame without having any oversight, and she wanted to unload it. And it took, I think, a year or two for the legislature to make that determination, and they moved it to the Department of Health. So it predates either me or David Hurley being there.
Right.
There was. The Medical Practice Board really wanted complete independence. They didn't want to be tied to any state agency. They wanted complete independence. Today, first of all, the Office of Professional Regulation is nowhere near what it was in 2000. It's a very professional organization, very efficient. We have top-notch people running it. The attorneys on it, the investigators. We have certified law enforcement investigators. So it's a really top-notch group. And I will say that we have pretty much every medical profession except for the docs. The docs are on their own in the Department of Health. We did a study a year ago about how we could take advantage of the Office of Professional Regulation. This is by the administration, by the way. Now, we did the report, but the administration and us were colluded on it, if you want to call it. And it was really of the mind that we really ought to look at how we can combine, get back together again. And there's going to be resistance. It's a political issue, and I don't mean political as in partisan, I mean political as in the two different sides. But, there's a lot of good that could come out of it. For instance, best practices, good legal services. We have a strong IT and licensing system technology. We have the office space. It's not something that's necessarily needs to be separate anymore because OPR is completely different. So we're hoping, and that report also that we did was something that the legislature asked us to do with the administration, and it's also there. So we have 50 professions and 75,000 license holders in OPR, but there are another 30 to 40 professions that are licensed throughout state government. For instance, plumbers and electricians are under public safety.
Right.
UI has, not UI, but DOL has tramways and whatever.
Right.
Then you have, there was some stuff over at A&R. We've now picked up most of the A&R licensing, like wastewater and water system operators and whatever.
You were looking at DMV licensing there for a while, Mr. Secretary.
Not me necessarily.
Oh, somebody before you?
Yeah, so there are 3 states that actually the DMV is under the Secretary of State. It's Maine.
Oh, right.
Maine, Michigan, and I think Illinois is the 3rd one.
Right.
And I know my colleague from Maine, Matt Dunlap, he's a real good guy, and he says to me, "You don't want DMV."
I say nothing. It's a good group.
It is a good group.
Yeah.
So anyway, there's electricians, there's teachers. We've had conversations with the Agency of Education about bringing their licensing over to us because we're talking about just handling the nitty gritty stuff, not what the criteria are to have a license. But once we have that, once someone gets it, then we can put it into place.
Right.
So we're looking at how we can improve. And the other thing is a lot of states, I was down at a conference once in Texas, and I walked right by this building, and it's the Office of Professional Regulation and registration. And, all that stuff is in one roof, under one roof. And here in Vermont, it's scattered throughout state government. Right. So someone, if Ben is looking for, he wants to file a complaint against an electrician, he has to know where to go to do that. And it's not always easy to find, as you know, Pat.
Well, no. Well, we did enjoy talking to David. He enjoys the job and seems to be doing it well. I love David, so he's a good guy. And 33 years in the military. He just stepped down, for heaven's sake.
I know.
Yeah.
I remember when I was in GovOps, he had to go overseas, I think, to either Iraq or Afghanistan, or maybe both.
Yeah, he served over there twice. Anyway, didn't you and I work on voting registration at DMV that would transfer over to your office?
Yes.
Yeah, it was a little rough start, but we did it, I think, finally.
Yeah, well, and the first time we did it was actually, I think you might have done that with Deb Markowitz before me.
Oh, maybe.
But it was basically a little tear-off sheet at the bottom of the license form. And we, when Rob Ide was there, I called him up one day, 2 weeks after the election, because 2 weeks after the election, I received a stack of about 1,000 voter registrations. And of course, that form, you could hardly read it half the time because people would write so small and scribble. And it really didn't give us accurate data. But anyway, I called him up and I said, bring Mike Smith over here and let's talk about this. That's when we actually were able to put it online in their system, so that they could then download. So we get an upload from DMV every night for anybody that has a interaction with the DMV for licensing, whether it's new or old. And as you know, people don't forget to go to DMV to change their address when they move, but they do forget to go to their town clerk for their voter registration. Well, since January of 2017, we've had automatic voter registration, which really is a upload from DMV. And Ben, I think, did you work on this too, Ben, when we were passing it?
Yeah, I did work on this.
Essentially, it gives us a more accurate database in voter registration because we're getting updates as soon as people move.
Right.
Well, the first year it didn't work really smoothly because I do remember putting in a few extra hours way past the closing of the ballots. We were calling judges and people were not so happy, but it's fine now, I'm sure. Yeah, it was me.
That's why it's all electronic now.
Yeah, that's right. It's me.
You don't have to deal with those tear-off forms anymore, although I do remember those.
Yeah. So, Bon, maybe we should skip to the COVID stuff, and you can scoot in on the question.
Obviously, the pandemic has impacted everyone in state government. How has it impacted you guys, both from an operational standpoint, but also like priorities in the legislature? Because the legislature's had to change kind of what they're doing as well.
Sure. So I guess the first thing I would say is we saw this coming back in the end of January, early February, and we did an actual. I mean, we were reading the tea leaves, if you want to call it, the stories around the country and around the world, and we could see that there was a possibility that this pandemic was going to hit us. So we did a quick inventory of. I have 75 employees that work for me, and we checked with each one of them to find out what are their capabilities from working from home. Did they have internet access? Did they have a computer? We ordered extra computers to have on hand. And because over the last 10 years, we've actually upgraded all of our IT systems, we were really ideally set up for when we sent people home and said work from home. Those that needed a laptop, we gave them one. They have access into the systems, and it really, from that standpoint, our doors have been open, so to speak, without having our doors open physically. So we've been able to do all the work that we had before. Sometimes what it is someone might call in and then we have to get a voicemail, but or by email. We've got we have 3 facilities, one in Middlesex where Vasara is at 128, 2 doors up from the DMV, and then at 89 Main Street in the city center. At every one of our doors, we have a list that here's the number to call, here's an email to send an email, whatever. So we've been operating pretty much right along without any real problems. There are always people who are uncomfortable with technology, and we can work with them. We talk them through it on the phone. We can actually meet them at the office if we have to. It's a last resort, but we have some pretty talented people who are able to talk people through on the phone. But speaking of OPR, one of the bills that we worked on this year, which has actually got legs again, it's actually moved, I think, to second. I'm not sure if it got to third, if they moved it through all stages today, but I know it passed second reading, and that's our OPR bill.
Go to the House or Senate, Jim?
In the Senate. In the Senate. Then it's got to go to the House.
Yeah.
So Jeanette had that one first. And essentially, it has a bunch of stuff in it. It's S-233. It basically fast tracks our endorsement process from other states. We are able to do criminal background predetermination before we tell someone you got to go invest $5,000 in this education in order to get licensed. They might want to know if their criminal background is going to hinder them from getting a license. So we do a predetermination for them, military spouse fee waivers. We had a case where we took it upon ourselves to approve it, but it was a military first aid or whatever medic, and he came out and he wanted to get his nursing license. And based on what the law said, he was going to have to go to nursing school and all this stuff. But we worked with the governor and got, we agreed that his background met all the criteria. So we gave him his license.
That's great.
And then we added, as you might remember, Pat, we do what we call a sunrise review. When someone says, I want this profession to be licensed, we do what's called a sunrise review. So we look at, okay, what's it going to take to bring this up to a licensure? And we hold public hearings, we research it and all that. But what we also found, which I think Pat, you would be really supportive of, is a lot of times in the legislature, they pass all these laws, but they never take anything off the books. So what we also passed was what we call a sunset review that will allow us to review professions if we feel that, yeah, maybe this shouldn't be licensed any longer. For instance, one of the holdovers for us has been, and I don't want to make anybody mad, but one of the holdovers for us was auctioneers. And
really?
with auctioneers, so we license auctioneers, and they want to be licensed. But the problem is we've never really had any cases against them, and any case that would come against them could probably be handled in small claims court. So is it necessary to license it? And so we're looking at things like that, that we're looking to see where we can improve our licensure. The other is business portal. We've been working on a next generation business portal that will be more interactive. So if you come in and say, I want to open up a convenience store, but you don't know what you need to do, well, we all know that you got to register with our office, you got to go to DOL, and you got to go to tax. Well, you might have to go to A&R, Ag, and any number of agencies to get other licenses. What we found in looking at some of it was, for instance, to open up a convenience store, you need something like 27 different licenses. There's actually a license to sell beef jerky. There's you have all these things that are out there. God. And to sell milk, you have to have a license. To sell, different things, obviously liquor, but so we're looking at all how we can put a more interactive business portal in place, that where someone comes in and says, okay, I'm going to open up a convenience store, and it pops up and says, these are the licenses you need. And then it walks you through all of that. I want to open up a barber shop. Here's what you need to do. Here's the different licenses. Something that's a little more interactive. That's great. And makes it easier for people, basically a one-stop shop.
That's awesome. Good for you.
It's a great idea.
And we're dealing now with the funding for it, because obviously this is not cheap. It's going to be about a $2 million project, and that's just to basically do the existing three, DOL, tax, and Secretary of State, plus add ACCD at this time, and then we can start adding other agencies as we go.
Is any licenses being dropped, like why you need licensing to sell beef jerky? Sort of boggles the mind. Maybe that's something they don't need.
That's for the ag department to.
We'll have to talk to Ensign.
Now we have to have a conversation about this.
That's great.
Oh, goodness.
So listen there, Mr. Condos, you've got a couple of things cooking here about how we're voting this coming November. I think it's still November. We're talking about changing it to August, but it's back on November according to the bill they passed.
Well, there's two elections.
Well, there's actually
but they were. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say there's actually the statewide primary, which is different than the general election. The general election is in November. The statewide primary is in August. Yeah. Specifically, it's August 11th. Early vote ballots go out starting on June 26th. So we have to, by law, federal law, we have to send out all our overseas and military ballots 45 days ahead of time. And that also happens for the general election. But we're actually not proposing any changes to the August primary. The August primary will run as current law allows. The only thing that we're going to do differently is we're going to send a prepaid postcard to every active registered voter to say, please send me my ballot by mail. Yeah. And so it's basically an absentee ballot.
Right.
Which, by the way, the law exists already today, and that's 30% of Vermonters in our elections do vote by mail or early vote walking in the town clerk's office. So for the August primary, that's what we're doing. The little kerfuffle that's been going on is between the governor and I, and actually I would classify it really as just a disagreement. He actually agrees with most of what we're saying. but he just doesn't think that we should. He thinks we should wait till after the primary because you can't print ballots until after then anyway. The problem is, and we're using two local vendors here,
Right.
printing envelopes and printing ballots. They have to know now for the November election. People have asked me, why don't you do this for the August primary? Well, we would have had to known this back in probably
Right.
February
Yeah.
in order to get things in place. But I think.
So your staff made the most amazing appeal to the legislature yesterday, because I think up until now, they were saying, whoa, because they had to kind of sort it all out and figure out what needed to be done. And now there's a little urgency, as you're saying, because there are so many details that have to be done and done right, that they need the time to get her done. So they did pass the bill out, but they took the governor. What did they do? I have it written. They said he should work with you, but not necessarily. Oh, you don't have to agree with him. They took the word agree out, which some are upset about. So
Pat, here's the story behind that. So when COVID started to expand throughout the country, we went to the legislature and asked for some emergency relief power to be able to make changes to election law without having to come back to the legislature. So the legislature originally was going to pass a bill that said that the Secretary of State will propose directives in consultation with the governor. A certain member of the House added the words "and with agreement of the governor."
Mm-hmm.
When I met with the governor on one of these calls on May 2nd, his first words out of his mouth was, I didn't want to be in this position. I never asked to be in this position, and it wouldn't bother me if they took me out of this position.
Oh, okay.
So it has not been against the governor. He just wants us to wait, and he wants us to do everything up until August. And then we'll decide whether we're going to follow through. My problem is it's federal money. And if I were to spend $1.5 million putting all the stuff in place and then say, oh, just kidding, we're not going to do this.
Right.
The feds could come back to us and claw back that money. And I said, I don't want to be put in that position. So we need to make this decision now. I even offered an off-ramp that if he and I both agreed, because the legislature said it was the governor and the Secretary of State had to agree. So I said, okay, so if we both agree in August that we don't need to do this, then we can that'll be our off-ramp. He didn't want that. And I really think he defers to us as the experts on elections. He has said this publicly. And I think really what he said, he's fundamentally not opposed to vote by mail. He said we must do everything we possibly can to protect Vermonters.
Right.
He, Dr. Levine, Dr. Fauci at the national level have all said we should expect to see a resurgence of this virus in the fall. We just don't know when.
Right.
And I'm saying to the governor, if we do this in August, if we make a decision in August, I'm done till November. I can't change anything after that.
Yeah, you're stuck.
If this thing surges in September or October,
right,
we're cooked, and we can't really change things at that point. So really, it came down to the only. He also, his concern was he wanted to make the decision in August, and he wanted to return to normalcy as quickly as possible. I said that really this is not that far from being abnormal, because if you think about it, the only thing that we would be doing different is directly mailing a ballot to every active registered voter. The everything else will be the same.
Jim, would it be the same with all three ballots? And you have to you use one ballot, you put one ballot in one envelope and the other two in the other, is it that same sort of complicated
No,
mail? Oh,
that's
okay.
the primary.
That's the
You're talking
primary.
primary.
Oh, okay, you're talking, I'm
For the
sorry,
general
because,
election, it's a single ballot.
Single
It's just
ballot
one
for that.
ballot.
right, of course, I'm sorry.
So,
Yeah, because one of your guys was talking about the complexity of the,
Right.
November, about that they have to write all kinds of notes and tell people what to do, and,
So here's what has to happen though, Pat. So if we do a direct mail of the ballot to every registered voter, we have to make sure we got the voter's right address on the envelope. Inside of that envelope has to be the correct ballot. And we have 275 different ballots for the state of Vermont for the general election.
right.
So we have to make sure the right ballot goes into that envelope. And then the return envelope has to be to the town clerk, has to be to the right town clerk. So you have all these pieces that have to be lined up. And that's part of the problem that we have to deal with to make sure everything works right. As far as the security of that ballot, so if you voted by mail before, by absentee, you have to put your ballot, once you vote your ballot, you put it inside of what's called a certificate envelope.
Right.
And essentially it's an affidavit. You have to print your name, you sign it saying that I didn't get influenced on this. This is my ballot. And then you seal it and put it in the return envelope and mail it back. So from the standpoint of the voter, all this is one additional option that they could actually receive their ballot at home, and they can return it in the prepaid envelope. They can walk it into their town clerk's office
right.
During the early vote period. They can walk it into the polls on election day, and if they misplaced it or lost it, they can walk into the polls, and the poll workers will check their list, and if you're not checked off, they'll give you another ballot to vote. So everything else about it stays the same, except for that one piece. It's just a direct mail. This is not a requirement to send it back by mail.
Okay, and I get to say as a voter, yes, I want to vote this way. You send me a card and I say yes.
No, that's the primary.
That's the primary.
For this one, we would send you the ballot.
Okay.
We would send you the ballot, but you don't have to vote it.
Oh.
You get your ballot. You don't have to vote that ballot. You could walk in on election day and walk into the polls and vote there. Or
as long as you haven't returned your mail ballot.
Yeah, Carol Dawes from Barry City was talking about what she's going to have to do just to keep people 6 feet apart and keep everybody safe, which is not going to be an easy task in some places if they get a lot of people.
So that's exactly, Pat, that's exactly what we're trying to do, is drive down the numbers of people coming into the polls. Because if we're still in a quarantine type situation where we have to maintain social distance and all this, which they're saying is going to be around for a while, then we want to make sure that we reduce the number of people who are actually walking in. So think about this, Pat. On general election in November, we have 300,000 plus voters that vote. And they vote in 275 different polls locations scattered around the state of Vermont. If we've got 300,000 people going through these polls, that could be a significant problem for spreading a disease if there is still going on.
Right.
That's totally. And this is only a 1-year event. So this is a 1-year session law to allow us to do this. The governor already approved it for local towns. There are 9 school budgets that were rejected. There were about
they got to do that.
And there were about 10 other towns that had their town meeting budgets. They don't vote on town meeting day. The governor already approved allowing some of those towns to use vote by mail. So this is really not, it's not rocket science, but there's a lot of work and infrastructure that has to go into place. And just to put it in perspective, there are currently 5 states in the country who already do universal vote by mail. It's Colorado, Washington, Oregon, Utah, and Hawaii. Now, I'll be the first one to say, Pat, that I don't think Utah is considered a blue state. It's got a red house, a red Senate
Yes, it
and
does.
governor. So, you
Yes.
know,
It's a shame this has turned into some kind of a Democrat Republican thing, and it shouldn't be. And Jeanette White was talking about that. This should not be political.
that's exactly
Everybody should vote, right? I mean, I don't get it, right? Well, I hope they hear your explanation because it makes more sense when you hear it in person. Sometimes the papers don't quite cover it in the same detail as you are. So
they determine, the papers happen to determine what they think are important points.
right.
Where I can actually attest to there are certain things that need to be said.
Well, when I heard
So
Carol Dawes being good about it, I was sort of okay. She's my go-to clerk.
So yeah, and Carol actually stated yesterday at that meeting that the majority of the clerks are in favor of doing this because it's going to take a lot of work off their plate too.
Yep, sure. I think she's still the head. She's still the head of the Clerks Association. She used to be for years, anyway.
Yeah. Well, she's actually the head of the what they call the legislative committee.
Yeah. Oh, really? Good for her. Yeah.
So why? So here's a kind of a hypothetical question. Why not treat the general election in November the same way you're approaching the primary in August, where you're sending out those ballots, those postcard reminders saying, "Hey, don't forget you can vote by mail. Request a ballot and mail this back."
So, and that's a great question, Ben. And really, it's pretty simple. The clerks would get overwhelmed with having the administrative side of this because that work would then fall onto them. We're planning on doing the mailing out of the ballots centrally from a central mail house. You know, we're working with L. Brown and Jet Service, and they're going to coordinate this. It's really a large part of it has to do with the amount of work that would fall to the clerks in this period of time. And especially if you think about it, if a surge occurs again and their offices are closed, they don't have the help that they normally would have.
Right.
It really, you know, when you look at, you know, like Montpelier or Barrie would have, you know, 5,000 to 6,000 voters. If you have to send out those ballots for those folks. So we're trying to take that off their plate, and all they have to do is receive back the ballots when they come back in and check them off.
That's a whole lot of coordinating those printing companies are going to have to do.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Really
and one error will just drive people crazy that won't understand it.
Well, that's true of anything.
Sure, for sure. This is new, so they'll all be watching, waiting for that one error.
So we've got about 5 minutes left. One other thing that we should talk about, because it's relevant to this discussion, is you've been pretty out in front talking about some of the struggles that the U.S. Postal Service is going through.
Yeah.
And that obviously is pretty impactful when we're talking about a majority, if not a vast majority, of people voting by mail in both August and in November. So have you gotten any updates there? Anything that, you know, has assuaged any of your concerns about the stability of that system?
Well, I do know that the bill that came from the U.S. House to the Senate that Mitch McConnell's sitting on right now did have money to fully fund the Postal Service at least through the end of the year. The Postal Service is critical not just here in the United States but across the world when is in the area of democracy and ballots. When we have to send our ballots out to overseas and military voters, it goes through the mail, and a lot of it. Sometimes it goes through by email, but it still comes back to us by mail because we have to have the actual ballot coming back. So it's kind of. I understand what the president's trying to do, but on the same hand, he wants to drive up costs on us. He wants the Postal Service to charge Amazon more. Well, where do you think Amazon's going to get their money?
Right.
From the people who buy from Amazon. Where do you think if postal rates go up, where is that money going to come from? It's going to come from the citizens, from the companies who have to use the mail service. I always, I actually, my counterpart from the state of Washington, Republican state Secretary of State, Kim Wyman, she and I penned an op-ed. I think you had seen it, Pat. But she and I had penned an op-ed basically that our democracy does depend on a reliable postal service. And we're, in the grand scheme of things, we're not talking about a lot of money. I mean, yeah, it is money. It's big money, but it's when you look at some of the other things that they fund, it's not a lot of money. And the Postal Service has not been treated the same as any other federal agency. They have to prepay all their benefits. They have to prepay all their pensions and stuff. No other federal agency does that, just the Postal Service. And that's driven some of their cost up. But think about this. You mail an envelope today from Montpelier with a 55-cent stamp on it, and you're mailing it, let's say, Ben, you're mailing it to a brother in San Francisco. 4 days from now, it arrives in his mailbox.
Right.
That's pretty incredible when you think about the millions and billions of pieces of mail that are being processed, that piece of mail gets there and it only costs you 55 cents. Now,
Jim,
I'm not saying,
yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I'm not saying that we shouldn't raise some of those costs, but when you raise the Postal Service costs, you're raising it on all of us. And there was a poll done, and the Postal Service was the top federal agency as far as favorability, like 90%.
Sure it was.
Exactly.
Yeah, because it's the one that functions the best.
So,
Jim, when you have a big mailing like this, do you call them in advance? Because it's Montpelier, it's Burlington, it's White River. You give them an opportunity to bring in staff? Because if you're hitting them up with all of this mail, from Brown or from Jet Envelope, they could be overwhelmed if they don't have the staff.
Well, for what it's worth, Pat, we've actually been in discussions with the Postal Service for the last month and a half. They helped design our envelope because we're prepaying the envelope. They also, the envelopes across the country, it'll say election mail on it. It's got a certain insignia, so that the Postal Service, no matter where you are in the country, knows that this gets a priority over other mail. So it's election mail, and it gets a high priority. So yeah, we've been working on them. That's part of the stuff that we've been doing. While we're having this discussions with the governor.
Well, that's great. We really thank you for being on the show, Jim. This is so timely because I think you've given such a great explanation. We'll get this out as soon as we can to people. And you're announcing your candidacy on the show, Jim?
I am running for re-election as Secretary of State.
So cool.
I like how she
This is our first coup. So excited. Thank you very much. You've done a great job. I appreciate it.
All right.
So we'll see you. And thanks, Ben. And thanks for listening in, and we'll see you next week. And in the meantime, keep listening beyond the sound bites. See y'all.